Hello, product people. Welcome to the Product for Product podcast, hosted by Matt Green, data advocate and product manager, and Moshe and Andrew, product leader and author. Our goal is to serve the product community by helping you find products that can help make your work in product management easier. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the Product for Product podcast.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about the A/B testing tool VWO. Andrew Miller is joining us today to talk about his experiences with the tool. Andrew was our first guest on Product for Product, so we're happy to have him back. Welcome back, Andrew.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Appreciate it.
Hey, Andrew. Hey, Matt.
Hello. How's everybody doing?
Good. Doing good.
That's good to hear. Tell us what have you been to since we talked with you last time on episode 2?
Yeah, so we built an experimentation program with the team I've been working with, and let's see, the first quarter that we got it up and running, if I remember correctly, we designed 23 tests, we launched 11, and 2 of them ended up being winners. So there's a pretty nice kind of skin on the wall for the team the first quarter. We ended up lifting the number of applicants applying for life insurance in this case by 28%.
Oh, wow. That's nice.
Excellent.
Just remind us again the name of the organization.
This is with Bestow.
Bestow, right. Perfect. And all of that you've done with VWO?
Yeah, it was all the tests were running through VWO. We use a variety of other tools to kind of manage the experimentation pipeline and of course do the design work. But the actual tests themselves and kind of the preliminary data tracking and reporting for the results is all managed with VWO.
So we are here to hear about it. Tell us all about that.
Yeah, I mean, VWO has been good. There's a variety of features. I'm kind of looking at it right now, and they break it up into sort of 4 main sections of features. There's an Insights tab, which you can kind of use to do, I'd say, like general analytics on your product if you want. You can set up tracking throughout the product where you need it, and you can view things in terms of funnels. You can view heat maps, session recordings. You can collect feedback, qualitative feedback from your users through surveys and forums. Then there's a testing tab, which is the one we primarily use the most. And they support 3 types of tests. There's A/B testing, multivariate testing, and split URL. And there's a planning tab, which is kind of more focused on, what's your experimentation process like? What are you learning along the way? What sort of ideas do you have and hypotheses? And there's features to kind of help you track and manage that aspect of experimentation. And then there's a deploy tab as well, which actually lets you launch the test and put it into prod.
How long have they been using the VWO there? Was it there when you got there?
It was not. Actually, when I joined, we had just settled on choosing VWO when I joined. And kind of my first month and a half, 2 months with the team was one of the things that we were focused on was implementing VWO and integrating with their system. So I'd say we've been using it for about 9 months, 8 or 9 months.
Okay. Was there any other competition in terms of other applications you were looking at?
There were, but those predated me by a couple of months. And by the time I got there, the team had pretty much decided. Yeah, gotcha. Pretty much. And I think it was the way that we went about it. It was kind of like, okay, at a high level, what does product need? What does design need? And from there, let's let engineering drive it to kind of figure out, which tool they want to work with the most. And that's kind of how we went about it in terms of deciding.
That's interesting. So the decision factor was more on the engineering end of things.
Yeah, I think so.
So the tests that you guys are doing, are they front end or back end or combination?
So they're front end tests. It's a good question because that actually came up recently. And for the most part, that's been fine, constraining ourselves to running tests on the front end. Mm-hmm. But there was actually a test that we were running recently, and this was one of the more complicated experiments that we've designed. And we had to launch a handful of additional tracking events and really kind of think through how to measure success for this one. And we were never really fully satisfied with how it was designed. And after running it for a couple of weeks to see what the data was looking like, it kind of, at least in my mind, clarified that we really do need back-end testing for that type of test. Because what ended up happening is, let's say, so someone's applying for or trying to get a quote for life insurance, and we offer them a price at quote. Well, that price is actually determined initially on the back end, and then it's served up to the front end. And we only wanted to bring individuals that fell within a certain price range into the test, but we weren't able to do that the way that our system was set up. So we had to bring everyone into the test before they got a price, and then only the people that fell within the price range actually potentially entered the variation. So it really just muddied our data, and really kind of became the first example of, really kind of needing back-end testing as well.
And they support back-end testing?
They do, yeah, but we don't have that integrated. It's an additional pricing tier, so we would just have to go back to VWO and say, hey, we want back-end, and probably some additional integration work.
Yeah. So the reason I'm asking, why the engineers were part of this decision is because usually in the other products that we were talking about, the front-end testing, you have a WYSIWYG way to build your different tests, then you don't need a lot of engineering work, where the back-end testing usually will require a lot of engineering work. So how is that done with the VWO? Or is there a need for engineers to actually put those tests together?
Yeah, in this case, we actually haven't used the WYSIWYG feature. They do have one. I think they call it the visual editor. We've talked about opening that up to the marketing team, and they've asked for a couple of times if that might be possible. And we're sort of trying to figure out the right way to make that available to them in a way that doesn't potentially confuse things downstream in the code. But yeah, in this case, the front end testing, it's experiences that are designed by UXers and then developed by engineers and then deployed through VWO. So there's code that needs to be written in React in this case for the test to be possible.
And how far do the engineering work goes? Are they fully fleshing out the development of each one of the options, or do they do more of a high level of that just to get the feedback and do the experiment?
Yeah, I'd say the way that we've been running things is we try to cull down the scope before we hand it to engineering. So by the time we hand it to engineers, they're pretty much building to spec. But we've gone through a few cycles of trying to reduce complexity so that it's not a very large lift. There's some associated goals with that. So like we run on 2-week sprints, and being in insurance, compliance, and legal is a really big factor for a lot of what we do. So the way that we've set up our goals for experimentation is we have 3. First, we want to submit 2 to 3 concepts to compliance every single sprint. The next is we want to develop a new concept fully from 0 to 1. And the third is we want to actually launch a test through VWO. So, and we're pretty good about hitting all 3 goals consistently. So in this case, we're submitting 2 to 3 to compliance every sprint. So that's a larger number than the number we're developing and launching. So our backlog is continuing to grow sprint over sprint. So at this point, we have a pretty nice, healthy backlog of tests, and we won't build all of them, and that's sort of by design. And yeah, the goal is basically to develop and launch a test every sprint.
And did you guys ever do like an ROI for that? Because to develop things, fully, it's also could be quite expensive sometimes. And when you develop different options, so yes, on one hand you've done, you said a 28% lift on something, but does that already taking into account the expense that it took to do it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So you're asking, like, does the 28% lift make up for the engineering time spent developing, or the design time spent designing?
It's both, because that's a whole process on both ends. So let's say it's just an A/B test or 2 variants, and you have to design both of them and you have to build both of them. I don't know how different they are or not. So in some cases, there could be very different from each other, and therefore it's a lot of work to develop both of those options. And that's where I'm always like trying to understand that balance between how much do you actually build for the experiments, so they're still going to be worth it.
Yep. Yeah, I think at this point in time, I would say probably not. Almost certainly not. The 28% left has not made up for the investment in terms of like salaries and so on. And I think that's, in my mind, that's okay. You don't want that forever, obviously. But it's pretty early days for experimentation for this team. So like, in that case, that was 3 months in. At the turn of the year, we'll be around 6-7 months into testing. I think, there's got to be some type of initial time investment and also money investment just to kind of get the program up and running. And,
right.
Eventually it should start paying itself off by, seeing very clearly, like, even if it's not exactly one-to-one, you can kind of see the groundswell happening and revenue is lifting and, the company is becoming more profitable and so on and so forth. And you can kind of tie links or attribution links back to, if not individual tests, like experimentation broadly, and then I'm probably preaching to the choir here a little bit, but, trying to find other ways to capture ROI or the value you're adding just by observing like what other teams are adopting these methodologies or the mindset of testing, what other teams are starting to optimize their own funnels or workflows or whatever it might be, or adoption of features. Because I think you can, and I have started to see that recently, which has been super rewarding, I think. Like other teams kind of looking at what we're doing and asking questions around how we think about designing tests, what some of the hurdles we run into are, and just noticing that they're starting to do similar things.
Right. Something maybe a bit more, personal to you as a product manager. When you design those experiments, do you have a bit of, almost like a rule to say, okay, this is as far as we can go with the design and development of a specific feature, and if we go beyond that, it's too much for the experimentation stage?
Yeah, I think so. Kind of coming back to those three goals: submitting 2 to 3 to compliance, developing a new one, and launching a new test. Part of the purpose behind arranging the goals that way is, me as a PM, I can say, I'm not necessarily going to put hard constraints on what the design of the test looks like or how much code needs to be written or how complex it is. But in this case, I'm sort of establishing fairly hard constraints around how much time we can invest on each test. So it's like, hey, design team, go design whatever you want. Like, let's work together. Let's collaborate, bring engineering in, bring all the stakeholders in. But you're free to go as long as you're submitting 2 to 3 to compliance every sprint. So, in that case, it's sort of like, okay, my UXers are professionals. They're smart people. They're able to make decisions within, that sandbox. And I'm just kind of establishing time constraints there and they're making decisions on their own based on that. And same with engineering. It's like, part of the process for design is if they haven't gotten engineering feedback to confirm that an engineer thinks that he or she can develop the test in about 5 business days is the rule of thumb that we use, then we probably shouldn't be submitting that to compliance because we already know it's going to not satisfy the downstream goal of being able to develop it rapidly. And so that's kind of how we've handled that, is by keeping the goals in mind and getting feedback from engineering throughout the design process so that we're trying not to design overly complex and overly expensive tests.
The last time we had you on the show, we were talking about the product Pendo. So I'm going to ask analytics questions. So when it comes to analytics, how does VWO perform in terms of providing insights and intelligence that you need to use in product management?
So they do have that insights tab, which is like, I'd say like product analytics broadly. I honestly, I don't use that because we have good analytics tooling in place already, and it would just be like redundant for us to adopt that suite of features. So I can't really comment on that one too much. For testing, they offer analytics too in terms of which goals within the test or conversions within the test are being satisfied at what rate. And I think the reporting there is good. There has been a learning curve for us. So pretty much most of what we're doing is funnel optimization. And so it makes a lot of sense for us to view things in terms of a funnel. And VWO does offer visualizations so that you can view your test results in a funnel, which is really helpful because what I've been doing historically is pulling all the data down and creating my own funnel in spreadsheets, and it's really time consuming.
Yeah.
But in order to be able to view things in terms of a funnel, you have to make sure that you have all of your tracking is identical across your, it's a little confusing because it's VWO terminology, but your insights goals as well as your testing goals, which are basically two different types of events.
Okay.
And they have to be identical in order for that data to like flow over to the funnel visualization in VWO. If that all sounds confusing, it's because it is a little bit, and it wasn't super intuitive for us. So I'd say like the analytics power and data visualization power seems to be there. It's just not as obvious to the team as maybe we felt like it should have been. So there's been a couple instances in which, we've been doing a lot of manual work to kind of add additional reporting on top of what VWO offers. And it turns out that they actually do satisfy that. It's just, you have to configure it a certain way.
Okay. Well, maybe that's one of the things that in terms of where they can improve, that might be an option for sure. Looking at their site, it looks like they have really good integrations. They reference the mix panel and the amplitude. So I definitely could see getting the data, getting the insights from other applications. So, and I also wanted to make a point around, they use the Bayesian statistics. I know we've mentioned that on some other podcasts prior. So just wanted to mention that that's what they're using for their stats.
Nice. Yeah. And I think those integrations, that's something that we haven't explored very much. So there's probably ways to extract a lot of value out of that that we just haven't really looked into. One thing that's come up recently is you can do a data export of your testing results. There's a summary version and a detailed version. And the detailed export is really great because I can pull that into a spreadsheet and I can look at the data session by session to see, how far along the funnel each user went and which variations they're mapped to and so on. And so we recently kicked off conversations with data engineering and the analytics teams to start pulling that type of data into our BigQuery instance so we can start to associate testing data with all of our other product data.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, which is super interesting and
yeah,
exactly where we need to be going. Our data engineering team ran into some hurdles because it seemed like that level of data wasn't really available through VWO's API. And so we were kind of scratching our heads a little bit like, oh, do we need to figure out how to connect this detailed CSV export to BigQuery on some sort of like cron job? Or is there actually something in the API that we're not seeing? And we haven't been able to find it yet and have chatted with them a little bit. So I think that's one thing that I think was a little bit of a miss. It's like that data should be easily accessible through their API so we can pull that into our broader data program.
Makes sense.
And then in terms of things that I love, it's just the testing features all across the board.
Yeah.
So we haven't used multivariate. We don't have really enough traffic to do that, but A/B testing and split URL, yeah, it's working great. And it's so nice to have this functionality in place. And it's definitely more. So last time we were on the show, we talked about Pindo. So like in terms of testing robustness and sophistication, it's quite a bit more sophisticated than Pindo.
Oh, wow.
For A/B testing. So
yeah, I believe that you told us also back then some of the type of experiments that you're doing with Pindo, which is more about fake doors or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So not so much like a full experience that you are actually moving through for users.
Yeah, that's a good call out too, because, and that might be a way that the two tools could work in conjunction nicely together, because, to the point that you were making earlier, Moshe, like it is a little expensive to have engineering build out these experiences. And so one thing that teams could consider is, what's our really lightweight, rapid sort of like fake door early signal testing tool? Pindo could be a good solution for that. And then things that are getting past that step, VWO could be a good solution for actually having engineers build out the experience. But that's been a change on my end in terms of, how I'm thinking about testing, because we are building out more robust experiences. And I think that's been really interesting.
Yeah, and you have also probably the actual A/B testing tool for that. Where Pendo is not really an A/B testing, you could do some A/B testing of the in-app messaging that they present, but it's not to test your own features and functionality.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
When I was researching VWO, they mentioned load performance. This is something not talked about in our previous episodes, I don't believe. So when it's in terms of like a performance, so if you're producing A/B pages to a customer, what if you don't want one to perform better than another in terms of when they click on something, whether it opens or not? So are you aware of that? How it's performing at all? Do they give you kind of any insight in how it's operating like that?
That's interesting. It certainly hasn't been a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So no flags have been raised around it. Like variation is like slow to load or anything like that.
Okay.
Now that you mention it, we did have, what was it? There was an issue where putting VWO on our marketing site was impacting marketing site performance.
Mm-hmm.
And it was pretty technical with the problem. And it was like 6 months ago, so I kind of forget the details.
Yeah.
But that did end up causing about a month of head scratching and kind of iterating amongst the engineers. Like, okay, why is this not working? And then we eventually figured it out, one of our engineers.
Did VWO help you with that to figure out what the issue is?
Yeah, he was in communication with them. I think he figured it out on his own, though, eventually. Because it was pretty unclear. And we also weren't running any tests on the marketing site. So that's what was surprising. It was just having VWO's scripts being loaded onto the marketing site that was causing problems.
It's kind of like a segue to the question we always ask about the company and how do you, how they interact with you. Are they obsessing about you and stuff like that? So usually we ask it a bit later in the episode, but we can already ask that now.
Yeah, I mean, they've been helpful for sure. There's a standing monthly call, I think, for about 45 minutes. And I think, this is probably the case for a lot of these type of like vendor relationship recurring calls, but really we get the more value we get out of those calls, it kind of depends on how prepared we are.
Mm-hmm.
If we've kind of come together as a team and tracked, what are some of the questions we have with the tool, what are some of the problems we have, and then we can actually come with questions, like that tends to help. But they certainly make themselves available, and when we do have questions, they've been pretty prompt to follow up and connect us with the right people.
So now tell us, like, what are the best 3 features you like and the best and the worst 3. So maybe if they listen, they can take it to heart and maybe improve them.
Yeah, I think that API, making the data accessible via API was kind of disappointing because we were really excited, to connect testing data with our broader product data.
So they don't support it?
Yeah, we weren't able to find it in the API actually to get like high resolution testing data, session by session testing data via API.
Okay. Any other things that you would like them to improve?
Honestly, I think that's the biggest one. There was kind of the confusion around how to. So you have 2 types of, I think they call them goals instead of conversions in VWO. There's insights goals and testing goals. And it's not, I think, super intuitive that those are separate and that you have to think of them differently, but you sometimes have to duplicate insights and testing goals so that data you're collecting in your tests can actually flow into the insights visualization tooling, if that makes sense. So there's some room for improvement there, kind of architecturally around like, do those need to be separate? Can VWO do some of the heavy lifting and kind of connect those 2 data streams together for the customer without engineering having to duplicate events and so on?
Yeah. And maybe on the flip side of that, things that you really like at VWO.
Yeah, honestly, like the testing features themselves are great. So I use A/B testing all the time. You can view heat maps and click maps of each test, which is very helpful for kind of figuring out exactly what's going on in the test. you can handle load balancing between the variations, which is very helpful. I think a lot of testing tools are going to have something like that, but I use it all the time because when we launch a test, I usually launch it at about 5%, and then I'll kind of bump it up daily just to build confidence and make sure nothing's broken. And I think their planning features are very interesting, even though the team isn't really using them very much. I don't know. I'm a little bit torn on that feature suite because on one side it's like, okay, cool, VWO built out a lot of like planning features to help you run experimentation, but on the other side, I have yet to work with a team where experimentation is fully managed in one tool. Like it's usually split across a variety of tools based on how people work. So it doesn't really fall into a like it or don't like it feature. It's more just like, oh, that's cool, I just don't use it. Maybe they didn't need to build it.
And by the way, how do you share the results with other people in the organization? Do you do it in the tool, or do you have another way to do it? Because I think that was also part of what we discussed with Romil, that in the first episode for this series, that it's not that common to see in applications something that does that.
We do not share results directly from the tool. I think we'd have to open up additional seats and get people in there and so that they can have viewing access. Additionally, honestly, it would be problematic if we did share results directly from the tool because the funnel visualization isn't working for all of our tests. We have to do a little bit of additional work to actually create, I think, an easily understood report. And so it would just confuse people if we tossed them in there and said, hey, here's the results. And
so there is more massaging of the data that they have to do after that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm usually doing it through Google Sheets or Google Docs.
Yeah, and I think one of the topics we were discussing back then was that with Romil was that especially in bigger organizations, when you have many different people doing different experimentations, it's because there is that lack of central sharing. It's sometimes hard even to tell who did what, and did someone already tested something like that or not, and things like that, and how does it affect other people, etc. So it also depends on the size of the organization. It might not be an issue for some types of orgs.
Yep, that's a good point. So where we ended up landing, we were kind of looking at Notion and Confluence as two options for where do we want to kind of centralize all of our testing logs and results and roadmap. We ended up going with Confluence because it's much more widely adopted throughout the organization. But the program manager on my team created this really great Confluence page that is sort of like the experimentation hub. And so it has the hypothesis links, all the relevant links to Jira tickets or VWO reports, spreadsheets, and so on. And then it tracks, whether it's running and how much traffic is going to the test and so on and so forth. So that's how we've gone about centralizing that information. I think it would be tough for us to use VWO for that problem because not everyone in the org is on VWO. And also, it's also not clear that the front end testing is going to be satisfactory for everyone. For example, like, one of the things that another team I know is thinking about testing is how to reduce lapse rate or alternatively churn. And that's just a really long test. Like it's going to take about 3 months to get data and then another 3 months to see if you changed it. And they could run it with VWO, but they don't necessarily have to. And I don't think there's any reason why they should feel like they need to if there's no alternative way for them to run the test that makes sense to them. So I think how I've been thinking of VWO is this is the tool that actually facilitates the testing itself, the A/B tests, the split URLs, the multivariates, and that's basically it. I don't really want to use it for a lot of the other sort of steps in the experimentation program because I think if you start to put all of your eggs in one basket like that, then you can run into problems as the organization more broadly adopts testing.
Who owns the tool in the end, whether it's engineering, product, or marketing? We've asked people in the past about who actually owns it in terms of maintaining it and whatnot. but it sounds like engineering is kind of led that, drive there. So
I think it's shared. I think,
okay.
And it should be shared. I think at the end of the day, it's the PM that really needs to be the owner.
Okay.
But the tool should be, in this case, because engineers are developing the tests, like the engineers should like the tool and they should, obviously know how to use it and feel comfortable with it. So there's some shared ownership there for sure, but I think it lands on the PM.
Mm-hmm.
Well, excellent. Yeah, that's all the questions I have. Moshe, did you have any?
Maybe just tell us where people can find you these days. If it's the same as before, or new places, or wherever it is.
You can find me on LinkedIn, Find Andrew, all over the internet at Find Andrew. You can find me on Twitter as well. But reach out on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to chat.
Perfect.
Andrew, thanks again for joining the show for the second time. Really do appreciate it. And this has been a lot of fun. And
I can't wait to have you for the third time as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Looking forward to it.
Another 6 months. Another 6 months, we'll be back at
it. Episode 62.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all the listeners, and we'll talk to you next time.